Switzerland, famous for its tradition of citizen participation, once again placed major national policy questions directly in the hands of voters through its quarterly referendum system. 4 times a year, Swiss citizens cast ballots on issues that in many countries would be handled exclusively by parliaments or executives. This round, however, carried unusual public attention because the proposals touched on deeply rooted aspects of Swiss national identity, military service, and the country's distinctive decentralized tax model. The most closely watched initiative was the proposal to expand mandatory national service, currently required only of men, to apply to women as well. Voters were also asked to consider a fiscal reform aimed at wealth concentration, the introduction of a federal tax on extremely large gifts and inheritances above 50 million Swiss francs, around 62 million US dollars. As vote counting progressed across the 26 cantons, the trend quickly became clear. Both measures were heading toward decisive rejection. The Citizen Service Initiative, which required approval from both a majority of voters and a majority of the cantons because it sought a constitutional amendment, failed to reach either threshold. Preliminary tallies showed wide rejection margins in most cantons, including those traditionally more supportive of social reforms. By midday, it became evident that the proposal had no viable path forward, cementing the status quo before all districts had even reported their final figures. Under Switzerland's existing system, about 35,000 young men enter the mandatory service structure every year, forming the backbone of the Swiss Armed Forces militia-based model. Unlike fully professional militaries, Switzerland relies on short, periodic training cycles and requires soldiers to remain mobilization ready for years after initial service. Men who do not serve, whether for personal, medical, or moral reasons, must pay an exemption tax unless they pursue alternative recognized civic duties such as civil protection work or conscientious objector service. Women may join voluntarily, and although participation has gradually increased, they still represent a small minority of the active force. Advocates of reform argued that this gender difference is outdated and fails to reflect modern expectations of equal civic responsibility. Proponents framed their campaign around expanding national resilience, noting that contemporary security challenges are not limited to warfare but extend to climate-related disasters, cyber attacks, energy shortages, and demographic pressures linked to an aging society. In their view, a broadened model of service, encompassing environmental restoration projects, care sector training, crisis logistics, and technological support roles, would distribute responsibility more equally across the population. Supporters further emphasized that Switzerland's traditionally strong spirit of civic duty could be strengthened if all citizens, regardless of gender, participated in a shared national experience. They also argued that national service could help build social cohesion at a time when many European states are grappling with polarization and declining trust in institutions. Still, the initiative met strong opposition across the political spectrum, not necessarily because the goals were unpopular, but due to concerns about cost, logistics, and social impact. Swiss lawmakers from multiple parties warned that transitioning to a universal service requirement would involve massive administrative expansion, including new training facilities, supervisory structures, and civic service placement programs. Economists noted that removing tens of thousands of additional young adults from the workforce each year, even temporarily, could amplify existing labor shortages in essential fields such as healthcare, construction, engineering, and hospitality. Switzerland already faces demographic pressures as its population ages, and critics argued that the economy could ill afford additional disruptions. The government also acknowledged the gender equality argument, but emphasized that Swiss women already perform the majority of unpaid domestic and caregiving labor. According to the Swiss Federal Statistical Office, women continue to shoulder a disproportionate share of household responsibilities and elder care, a reality that opponents feared the initiative would inadvertently worsen. While supporters believed the expansion would symbolize equality, critics argued that true equality must consider the full spectrum of obligations, including invisible or unpaid work. Ultimately, many voters appeared persuaded by the government's position that reform would introduce more burdens than benefits at this stage. The referendum unfolded at a moment when European states are re-evaluating their defense policies in response to geopolitical tensions. Countries such as Sweden, Denmark, Lithuania, and Norway have revisited or expanded conscription in recent years, driven largely by concerns over Russia's aggression following its 2014 annexation of Crimea and its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Although Switzerland is militarily neutral and not part of NATO or the European Union, it monitors continental developments closely, especially as questions arise about preparedness, cyber defense, and energy security. Supporters of the Swiss initiative argued that a broadened, non-militarized form of service would align with Switzerland's neutrality by reinforcing resilience rather than enhancing combat capability. They pointed out that crises such as floods, avalanches, and cyber attacks are increasingly likely, and that a larger pool of trained civilians would strengthen national readiness. Opponents countered that Switzerland already maintains strong territorial defense, robust civil protection units, and institutional preparedness. They noted that the militia system currently meets the operational needs of the armed forces and that expanding service obligations would not meaningfully alter Switzerland's security posture. Meanwhile, the referendum also included a second ballot item: the proposal to impose a 50% federal tax on portions of inheritances and gifts exceeding 50 million francs. Advocates claimed the tax could raise hundreds of millions of francs annually for climate mitigation, forest management, flood protection, and renewable energy transitions, areas where Switzerland must invest heavily to reach its 2050 net zero goals. They pointed to increasing wealth concentration and argued that the ultra-rich should play a role in funding national environmental resilience. The government, however, firmly opposed the wealth transfer tax, arguing that such a measure risked driving extremely wealthy individuals to move their tax domiciles abroad, a trend observed in other European countries that introduce steep inheritance or capital taxes. Switzerland's reputation for economic predictability, investor confidence, and cantonal tax autonomy is a cornerstone of its prosperity. Officials warned that introducing a centralized federal tax would disrupt this delicate balance. They emphasized that each canton already sets its own tax rates, allowing residents and businesses to choose jurisdictions that fit their needs. A single federal levy on large inheritances, they argued, would mark a significant departure from a fiscal structure built around decentralization and competition. Environmental groups expressed disappointment at the vote, but vowed to continue advocating for alternative climate financing instruments, such as green bonds or targeted emissions fees. Together, the rejection of both initiatives reinforced a familiar pattern in Swiss politics. Voters tend to favor incremental change over sweeping reforms, especially when proposals carry uncertain economic or administrative implications. The results reaffirm the strength of Switzerland's consensus-driven political culture, where broad coalitions and careful cost analyses often shape public decisions. As policymakers reflect on the referendum outcomes, they are expected to revisit issues surrounding national service models, wealth distribution, and climate funding. Yet any future proposals will likely be narrower, more targeted, and more financially detailed. For now, voters have opted to maintain a model that combines compulsory military service for men, voluntary participation for women, and a decentralized tax system designed to preserve cantonal autonomy and long-term stability.